I'll talk real quickly about just the current stimulus plan. People have said, well, is this having any effect at all? Right now, about $170 billion has been spent, either spent or has come back in tax cuts so far, using the standard thing we have in economics called Oken's Law. We can do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation, and that calculation basically says that that's probably the amount of people that are employed because of the stimulus plan is probably about 1 million extra people right now are working because that $170 billion has been spent and not. So there are some effects. You might not see it necessarily in the unemployment rate, but standard back-of-the-envelope calculations in economics suggest that that's the case. So that's basically the idea of fiscal. Now, there's this productive capacity we have that is not in use. The market, for some reason, is not finding a way to employ it. The government can. The government can pick up the slack here. I'll turn it over to Harry.
Thank you. John has talked about monetary policy, and Dan has talked about fiscal policy. What I want to do is to talk a little bit about regulation. There's plenty of blame to go around in terms of what caused the current contraction. And part of it is regulatory failure in the 1990s. I think some of it is easy money, as the other side would say, and there's no doubt about that too. But in terms of regulation, our view of regulation has changed over time. In the old days, regulation was more in terms of price controls, or in terms of the government trying to do more intervention in terms of directly doing what the market does. Most economists would agree that the regulation we want is to try to make the market perform better, to try to make the market work better. And in this case, there are three kinds of issues which come to the table. One is that we need more transparency in terms of what people are buying. If you take a common example, a lot of the debt instruments which were restructured in the 1990s, there was loans sliced up and repackaged, securitized. No one really knew what they were buying. And they should actually stop buying at that point, probably. But there was no transparency in these instruments, so-called collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, and things like that. The other issue is that there was conflict of interest in a lot of the decisions which were made at the macro level, and also in terms of the business institutions. For instance, you could say that rating agencies who rated a lot of these securitized packages gave them AAA ratings. There was a cozy relationship between these rating agencies and the fact that they were beholden to all these financial and corporate kind of clients who were giving them the business for floating new bonds, underwriting these new bonds. So there was a direct conflict of interest in terms of grading them, on an easy scale, because they wanted more business from these guys. So these kinds of conflicts of interest have to be resolved, besides transparency. Finally, the third mantra in terms of trying to create better regulation and better markets is this idea of accountability. In other words, if you take risk, you should bear the consequences of risk-taking. Now, if you do that, if you put accountability in terms of risk-taking, then the amount of risk taken will be moderate by itself. The market will discipline the amount of risk taken. If you can make loans, and you can pass on these loans in a securitized package to someone else, and just collect the loan origination fee, that means there's no skin in the game for you. You get your $2,000, $3,000 in terms of the loan origination fee, and then you're done. You don't have to do due diligence in terms of what kind of lending you're doing, or whether there's a high amount of default going on in the future. That's not part of your decision making because you have no skin in the game. So these are the kind of issues we have to resolve at the regulatory level. So that's my mantra. Conflict of interest resolution, more transparency, and more accountability. Now, Obama has a package of reform proposals up on the Hill, which is going to be debated pretty soon. And the question really is whether these package of regulations actually try to improve these three issues compared to what we have had in the past. And I sense, unfortunately, that this regulatory pendulum, there's a kind of a pendulum in the sense that for some time we just don't regulate at all. In the 1990s, the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and the FTC were kind of doing something like benign neglect. Say, well, the markets can function. People were telling Ellen Greenspan to try to regulate some of this easy lending, which was going on in the late 1990s. And he's a believer of the free market. And he said, well, the market will self-regulate itself. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff did not happen because there was conflict of interest, because there was lack of transparency, because there was lack of accountability. Now the question is, how do you actually try to create that? And let me just go very briefly in terms of what we need to do. And some of it is proposed in the proposals which are up on the Hill. One issue is that if institutions are too large, they're too big to fail, something like AIG, think AIG, then these institutions have to be transparent. They have to be accountable. Otherwise, they cause a large risk of systemic failure, the whole thing crashing down. A lot of these corporate executives who took an excessive amount of risk because their compensation was based on excessive risk taking, I don't fault them for it. I mean, if you can make a few $100 million in 3 or 4 years, I think that's good decisions for you. But the compensation mechanisms were structured in terms of not taking too much risk and getting rewarded for those risks in the short term, rather than basing it more in terms of long-term performance. So these too big to fail institutions have to be more transparent and more accountable. The other issue is in terms of consumer protection, that consumers have to be protected. Of course, if consumers make wrong decisions in terms of borrowing money and buying a big house if they can't afford it, they should pay the consequences of that. But a lot of the issues related to the consumer is that there was not full disclosure in terms of the kinds of loans made. And what they were buying into was not that transparent. So there has to be certain laws to try to make sure that that information is available to consumers. And in terms of accountability, you have to make sure that the person who is taking the risk actually bears the long-term consequences of that risk taking. So these are hard issues. We grapple with them for a long time. But I think it's important to understand that the operation, how do you actually make these things operational, will actually make, in the long run, markets work more efficiently and will sustain more growth in the future.
So now the case for active policy. Let's hear the other side.
Good morning. I'm the Larry of this team of Gary, Harry, and Larry. It sounds a little like Bo, Larry, and Curly. We've decided to divide up our time this way. I'll talk about the past, the lessons of fiscal and monetary policy of the 1930s, and then Mo and Curly will deal with the present and the future. If you could imagine for a moment a thief who goes door to door throughout a neighborhood, gathering up all the loot that he can get his hands on, and then he runs to the local shopping mall and he spends it. If all you did was interview the people in the mall, in the shopkeepers, you might easily be led to the conclusion that this guy was a public benefactor, because the shopkeepers are all going to say, hey, this was great, he stimulated my business, I'll hire more people if he'll come back and do that again. But you wouldn't be very thorough in your thinking. You would be ignoring the wealth not created, the unseen, that would have been directed by those to whom the loot actually belonged. And so much of our view of government spending, and of the 30s in particular, is skewed by this impaired vision. We saw some of that last night with references to FDR's programs like the CCC, the WPA. If you look at only what those programs did, it looks as though, wow, he's creating employment. But it doesn't consider the harm that other policies was creating that made the unemployment as high as it was. This kind of impaired vision is sort of like the drunk who stumbles up on a man's patio as he's barbecuing chicken on a rotary spit. And the drunk says, hey fellow, what's the matter? Your organ ain't playing and your monkey's on fire. You're not seeing everything, you're not seeing things very clearly. You heard it said last evening, and I about fell out of my chair when I heard this, that the 37 collapse was due to FDR cutting spending in 36. And therefore, more government spending would have been a good thing.